Welcome to the weekly Torah Power Up, based on the wisdom and teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, brought to you by Chabad of Nebraska. I'd like to ask you a question which you may have to reach back into your mind, into your days of Hebrew school to answer. Question: what do you think in your mind and all of your studying is the most obscure commandment or prohibition in Torah? I'll give you a moment to think about it. And actually, when we're done, I will mention the thing that I think is the most obscure or strange or out there law or prohibition commandment in the Torah. Have you got yours? So let me see if I can guess. And I may not, but I'll go through a few of the ones that might be practical, might be obvious to you guys. Firstly is the law of shatnez, the commandment that you may not mix wool and linen. Seems pretty strange. What's the problem with wool and linen? Why can't we put them together? What's the issue here? Another one would be the law of the red heifer, which a person who comes in contact with a deceased has to set himself aside for 7 days, and throughout those 7 days is sprinkled with the ashes and of a red heifer, and mixed with some bark of a tree as well as some grass, and he's sprinkled. And not only that, the person who sprinkles him with this ash mixture becomes impurified himself, while the person who's sprinkled becomes pure and can then mingle with the rest of society. Very strange mitzvah. Another one is actually a mitzvah where if a man dies childless, the brother of the deceased person is supposed to marry his brother's widow, is supposed to marry the widow. The rules are interesting, and I'm sure you can ask your local Orthodox rabbi to give you a little bit more information on this one. But I'll go with the one that I believe is most obscure. This is a rule called ben pikua. Very strange rules, very strange prohibition really, where if you slaughter an animal, let's say you slaughter a cow, and inside the cow you find a calf, which is actually alive, the ruling is that calf is considered to have been slaughtered kosher, just as the mother was. And you can eat that cow, you can eat the calf just as you'd be able to consume the flesh of the mother. It's completely considered slaughtered and koshered and ready to go. So these are some strange, obscure commandments that exist. Another one you may have heard of is the commandment that you can't eat blood. That seems a little strange, as in, why would anybody want to eat blood? But the truth is, if you think about it, any of the commandments or prohibitions that you've heard of might vary which one you find strangest based on where you live and who you are and your personality. So for example, if you lived in Germany, you would say that the prohibition against eating blood is actually not so strange, because people there actually consume foods which have blood inside them. They have blood sausage, for example. So there are things that are strange for us that live here in America versus people who live in other countries of the world, versus also strange mitzvahs for people who have certain personalities versus others. So really, the strangeness that we perceive of a mitzvah is based on who we are. Now, having said that, how do we approach these mitzvahs that we as personal people find a little obscure, a little strange, and a little out there, wild and weird? How do we approach these mitzvahs? And to answer this question, we'll discuss a passage in the Talmud that discusses specific mitzvos, and it says that a person could approach a mitzvah by saying that these things are disgusting to me, they're terrible, they're horrible for me, I would never do them anyways. However, the Talmud says that you should not approach mitzvahs in that way. You should approach them by saying, I would love to do these things, however, God has commanded, the Holy One, blessed be He, has commanded us against it, and therefore we cannot partake of these actions. So we are meant to, in a way, approach mitzvahs and say, these are things I would like to do, but I can't. God has told me not to. However, there is another perspective of saying that certain mitzvos are meant to be looked at as things that are obvious. Specific mitzvahs of between man and his fellow man, how to conduct yourself. They are commandments in the Torah, but they seem rather obvious. So much so that the Talmud tells us that certain commandments we'd be able to have learned from the animals. Even if the Torah had not been given, we'd know how to conduct ourselves as proper human beings without the rules being given. So with these two perspectives, it really gives us a very strong lesson in how to conduct our lives, specifically when it comes to keeping the commandments, keeping the Torah, as well as between man and his fellow man, how to have relationships with people, how to have your relationship with God, and also how to have your relationship with your fellow man. Let's take a look at this for a moment. In other words, when you are having a relationship with God, or anybody else for that matter, and they ask of you to do something, they want something from you, and not just want something from you, they have an expectation of you in that relationship, whether it be a relationship with another person who you, a sibling or a family member who you're estranged from. You're trying to rebuild that connection. So you have to kind of start from the beginning and rebuild it. And there's certain expectations that each side will have. So too, God has certain expectations from the Jewish people, how to behave. And we too have expectations of God to take care of us. But sometimes the expectation is something that is either something so weird and strange that why would I want to do something like that? Or it's something obvious that I would never behave in a way that would be that way anyway. Something that the person doesn't want you to do, but you were never going to do that anyways. So the approach we're talking about here, specifically with our relationship with God, is to try as much as possible to study, to look, and to think. This is something that I wouldn't do, let's say, anyways. This is an action that I would never have done anyways. I would never have drank blood. I would never have mixed wool and linen, let's say, but that's actually not so necessarily. Or things like that. Someone who could be allergic to shellfish and knows there's a commandment against eating shellfish. He was never going to do it anyways. But once you become aware that these are commandments of God, now you have begun to open up the conversation. You have begun to open up the relationship. And now you can begin building on it. You can begin building and saying, now I'm doing it only because I don't want to anyways. But I'm aware now that this is something that God wants, and we can start building and doing things even that we were going to do on our own, but now we're only not doing it because God has commanded us. And this can bring us to a much more fulfilled relationship with God and our fellow man, and really bring us to understand and appreciate God. And we start studying and understanding what are important things to God and what are important things in our relationship, and being a wholesome human being and a wholesome Jew. Once we start studying and understanding and realizing, it builds us to a much stronger place. And again, these are even things that we might not have been involved with anyways, things that were pretty obvious to us. Even so, once you start understanding that these are things that God wants, it begins that building, that first building block, which can bring you to a more perfect place, a better place, and a more wholesome place. Have a wonderful week.